Omar, would you like to elaborate on the Israeli blood diamonds issue?
There isn't much to elaborate at this point, but what I can say is that since the issue has been brought up and researched by members of the Irish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, especially Sean and some other researchers elsewhere, the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions National Committee, or BNC, is taking this issue very seriously, and we're currently researching it. So there isn't much I can talk about at this point. We're awaiting the research results to come out, and then the BNC will decide what to do with this. Since Israel's latest massacre on the Freedom Flotilla, the Gaza-bound flotilla of humanitarian relief ships, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, or BDS, has really skyrocketed around the world. After 5 years of BDS, the world was ready to respond to any new Israeli massacre by adopting BDS as an effective measure. This was particularly true since Gaza. Since Israel's massacre in Gaza, end of 2008, early 2009, the world started seeing that Israel is indeed acting like a mad dog. Like Moshe Dayan, the former Israeli defense minister, once said, that Israel should act like a mad dog, that no one would bother. Indeed, Israel has acted as a mad dog, and no one officially is bothering it. But there's a downside to this, which is that Israel lost the hearts and minds of the publics in the West. In other words, the international public opinion has dramatically shifted against Israel. Israel is viewed as the New World pariah, or as Scottish writer Ian Banks calls it, an outlaw state. This is a very popular view of Israel at this point. So Israel, while acting as a mad dog, massacring Turkish human rights activists, humanitarian relief workers on board the Mavi Marmara, it also lost the public opinion in the West. By attacking an Irish ship carrying Nobel Peace Laureate Muriel Maguire and other famous people, activists and professionals and so on, Israel has attacked the entire world, in fact. If Israel got almost away with its massacre in Gaza, partly by blocking access to the media and partly by presenting itself as doing self-defense, so to speak, actually it did not get away, but if it thought it got away, after the Mavi Marmara Freedom Flotilla massacre, it has become clearly, very clear that Israel is not getting away with it. This time it attacked 32 countries, activists from 32 countries, and it did an act that is 100% illegal. There's no question that it had absolutely no right, legal or moral right, to attack humanitarian relief ships in the high seas, in international waters. This has turned the tide against Israel in more mainstream circles than we had ever expected, in fact. BDS was launched in 2005 by a great majority of Palestinian civil society, all trade union federations, women's groups, students' groups, political parties, NGOs, networks, refugee advocacy groups, everyone was involved in BDS. But since 2005, until the Freedom Flotilla massacre, we have never seen a period when BDS has grown so fast as we have in the last couple of weeks, in the last few weeks. For instance, as you know, in Ireland, the Sunday Tribune main editorial called for a boycott of Israel. In Sweden, 3 main papers have also called for a boycott. Now, calling for a boycott is no longer considered something that's fringe or lefty. It has become much more mainstream as an effective measure, an effective tool that international civil society can adopt to hold Israel accountable to international law. Otherwise, there's nothing that's holding Israel accountable. Governments in Europe, the US, the hegemonic powers around the world are actually rewarding Israel for its human rights violations and massacres and war crimes. After Gaza, you would expect that they will take some punitive measures, or at least censure Israel for its war crimes. Instead, they welcome it in OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in Paris in May of this year. This was the largest reward for Israel for committing a massacre against 1,400
Unfortunately,
Palestinians.
Omar, Ireland's a member of it, and even one country out of the 32, I think, Ireland could have vetoed it, but, reprehensively didn't. It's allowed us to.
There was a lot of lobbying with Ireland, with Turkey as well, and other countries that we felt, Switzerland, Sweden, that we felt might take a different position, but we apparently had underestimated how insignificant the role all these countries play when it comes to setting policy, whether in Europe or in the world club of powers at large. It is basically the US and the big powers that decide policy. Smaller countries like Ireland get swept away. They don't want to stand out.
You could have done something good, but choose not to, you said.
We know from directly lobbying members of parliament in Ireland, in Dublin, that Ireland cannot afford to veto, to stand out against the consensus in Europe, because it's a small country and it fears Germany, France and Britain. Economically, Ireland is facing some difficulties and it does not want to get punished by its big sisters in the European Union. So there's this pragmatic consideration ahead of the moral and legal consideration. So while Ireland distinguished itself, at least verbally, in condemning Israel's policies, the siege of Gaza, the suffering of the people, the Palestinians in Gaza, when it comes to policy, it chose to join the herd, the European herd. It chose not to stand out. And this is the status of the world powers that we see today. No single country dares to stand out because it gets punished quite heavily by the US. Of course, you have the Venezuelas of the world and other countries that do stand out and do not care what the US thinks of them. But those are an exception. It's not the norm. Even a country as large as China did not dare veto the latest UN resolution calling for intensifying sanctions against Iran. And China has vital interests with Iran, but it has much, much more vital interests with the US, obviously. So it is very difficult at this point where states, where governments are really scared of raising the US's anger. This is why it has become far more important, far more important than in 2005 for civil society to take action, to shoulder the moral responsibility. And I think many church groups, many unions, many activists, many famous intellectuals are taking that position very seriously, and they think that unless stopped, Israel will continue violating international law, violating Palestinian rights, committing one massacre after another. If in 2009 it killed 1,400 Palestinians, predominantly civilians, if it is committing slow acts of genocide at this point, as it is in Gaza, it will move on to a much more aggressive, much faster genocide against Palestinians unless it's held accountable to international law. And I think many people are realizing that. So you have people like Alice Walker, people like Mankell in Sweden. Very famous intellectuals, writers, cultural figures have come out and decided to hold Israel accountable. Even performing artists, where it's a very high-profile issue. You have the Pixies, the Gorillaz, and Costello, Elvis Costello, and before him Gil Scott-Heron, and so on, deciding not to perform in Israel. They took a stand that we cannot afford to perform in Israel while it's continuing with its siege of Gaza and ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem and the Naqab, the Negev desert, and so on. So while Israel continues to violate human rights, international civil society just cannot stand silent in apathy, because it is held responsible through tax money that Westerners, especially Westerners, pay to Israel. All the funds that come to Israel, the diplomatic support, the academic support, cultural support, economic support, and so on, there's a responsibility that comes along with that. Along with the support that Western governments are providing to Israel, responsibility falls also partially upon citizens of those largely democratic countries, if you will. This responsibility makes it incumbent upon citizens of the West to stop Israel, to boycott Israeli goods, to boycott Israeli services, and more importantly, not just in the economic field, not just in the supermarket, as is happening right now, but also at the academic level, at the cultural level, to boycott Israeli academic and cultural institutions.
Well, I think civil society has to act as the kennel keepers of the mad dog, you know?
Absolutely.
Cage him or whatever, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
If you don't leash that mad dog, it will bite everyone.